The contingent of United States Marines, which had been traveling from Japan to the Middle East for over a week, has just arrived there. This has several implications for the future of the conflict against Iran. Of course, everything is still up in the air, but now it's time for you to understand what Marine Corps component this is. And most importantly, what ship is this that everyone is talking about? The ship in question, which has just arrived in the Middle East, is the United States ship Tripoli, an amphibious assault ship. This type of ship is highly specialized to provide support, really to act as a floating base for an amphibious invasion against an unknown enemy or foreign coast by United States forces in this case. But it's good for us to point out right from the start that these amphibious assault ships are actually quite common in the world's largest navies. The Chinese, the Russians, the British, the French, everyone has at least one of these ships, including the Brazilian Navy, and it basically consists of a ship that resembles a small aircraft carrier. It has a flat top there, right? A flat deck for operating helicopters nowadays, but also short takeoff or even vertical takeoff aircraft as well, right? And more recently, even drones. But one particular feature of this ship is that it has an internal bay that provides support and all the necessary assistance for launching small boats, right? Boats with Marines, the famous amphibious landing craft that can reach the shore directly from the ship itself. It's a compartment that can be flooded so the manned boats leave from there and can head directly to the coast. And although this concept today is quite broad and well known, it actually began back in the 1930s. Even at that time, in the 1930s, all amphibious landing operations had received very little air support. Up until then, few nations in the world had aircraft carriers to take planes to the enemy coast to be attacked. And one of those nations was Japan, over in the Pacific, right? So Japan, in those first landings it carried out there in the early 1930s in China, simply used aircraft carriers. The smaller ones, right, the escort carriers, to support ships that served as motherships for landing craft. But using aircraft carriers for this role of supporting amphibious landings was not a healthy option, because the aircraft carrier is made to launch air superiority planes, right? It's essentially an offensive weapon to fight at sea. This problem then was solved by Japan in 1934 with the launch and commissioning of the Shinshu Maru. It was a ship that had the capacity to carry dozens of landing craft internally and was also designed to carry about 26 aircraft. Those aircraft were supposed to be launched by large catapults located on the upper part of the ship, because this ship didn't have a flat top, right? It didn't have a flat top, a runway. But this capability of the Shinshu Maru, this ability to carry aircraft, was never actually implemented. And it spent its entire career simply as a support ship for amphibious landings. That capability to operate aircraft was also a prerogative, right? It was a pioneering move by Japan itself in 1942 with the launch of the Akitsu Maru, right? The commissioning of the Akitsu Maru. That ship was really the first one that had a flat top, right? The first that could operate aircraft on paper, dedicated to supporting amphibious operations on enemy shores, right? And it's worth mentioning that throughout World War II, the United States always worked with support warships for amphibious landings that didn't have air capability, right? The United States relied heavily on fleet carriers and especially escort carriers to support these amphibious operations. And let's remember that at that time, up until World War II and the immediate post-war period, amphibious landings were extremely complex operations to carry out, because the success of such an operation depended a lot on the geography of the beach, the weather at the time, the waves and the tide. All of this influenced the chances of success of an amphibious landing or not. Why? Because the only way to get soldiers from the sea to the beach was really through the use of landing craft, was really through the use of amphibious ships that reached the beach. But in the immediate aftermath of World War II, some very drastic changes would change that story forever. The first of these changes was the introduction of catapults on aircraft carriers, which, interestingly, did not exist in World War II. In World War II, planes basically took off under their own power. But with the introduction of jets, the ability to do that became quite limited, and jets then needed catapults to be launched into the air. And that ended up distancing the aircraft carrier even more from its role of supporting amphibious operations. Another very revolutionary change was the introduction of the helicopter as a means of carrying out amphibious assaults. At the beginning of the Korean War, the first American helicopters began to insert troops at specific points on the ground. That changed a lot of things. First, it eliminated the need for gliders, which were extremely necessary to do this just 5 years earlier in World War II, and it also made everything more precise. The helicopter wasn't useless after landing like a glider. It could simply take off again and retrace its path, carrying more and more waves of soldiers between 2 points. So, in the minds of naval strategists, it became very obvious that the helicopter was the amphibious assault vehicle of the future. From that moment on, everyone would have to think about helicopters for carrying out assaults against enemy beaches, and it would greatly decrease the use of landing craft. Very well. Who was it? The first country to use helicopters in an amphibious assault was the United Kingdom during the Suez Crisis or Suez War in 1956. Precisely to land troops in order to capture the Suez Canal, the United Kingdom used 2 escort carriers, Her Majesty's Ship Ocean and Her Majesty's Ship Theseus, thus transforming these ships into support vessels for amphibious assaults. Because each of these ships received the equivalent of a battalion of soldiers and several helicopters that began operating from their decks. So it was these helicopters that took those soldiers to the Egyptian coast. Seeing this example, which was successful, at least at first it was successful, the United States then began to carry out similar tests on their own. And the first tests the Americans did were the conversion of 3 Essex-class aircraft carriers, 3 of those large carriers from that time, into ships configured to support amphibious assault operations. So, these 3 ships, which were converted from Essex-class aircraft carriers, represent a transition of concept, a transition of means, a transition of thinking. Up until the configuration of the first class of ships designed to support amphibious assaults, which would be launched in 1959, the construction of the Iwo Jima class was approved, and the first ship of that class, the United States ship Iwo Jima, would be commissioned in 1969, and in total, 7 ships of the Iwo Jima class were built and put into operation. These ships revolutionized the entire practice of Marine Corps operations, because up until that moment, imagine this, up until that moment, the Marines really depended on Navy ships that were adapted for their operations. And it's not like everything changed overnight. But from the introduction of amphibious assault support ships, the Marines had a ship dedicated to their function, right? Truly dedicated, which fulfilled both functions of taking soldiers from the sea right up to the beach, and also by air, right? Through helicopters to protect these soldiers or even put them on the sand. It's worth mentioning that up until this point, amphibious assault to provide protection during the landing, not just to land. The troops are quite limited because they only use helicopters. You might have perhaps some attack helicopters, but nothing much more advanced than that until the introduction of the Harrier jump jet in 1969. Some other concepts of air superiority aircraft with vertical takeoff or short takeoff had already been tested before, but the British Harrier was the first Western model that really managed to become an operational weapon, right? So much so that the United States Marine Corps itself adopted the Harrier, right? That's a rare case in the American defense system, adopting a foreign model for a main role like providing support for amphibious landings. So the Harrier became a way for the Marines to provide support, real protection and firepower for their landings. This way, they complete the operational cycle of the amphibious assault ships. The Harriers are known as vertical takeoff and landing or vertical short takeoff and landing. Vertical takeoff and landing stands for vertical takeoff and landing, which means vertical takeoff and landing, and vertical short takeoff and landing is vertical short takeoff and landing, meaning vertical or short takeoff and landing, right? Because the Harrier could take off not only vertically, which uses a lot of fuel, but also with a short takeoff, using the help of a ramp. So we start to see on some amphibious assault ships the installation of a ramp at the bow of the ship. Finally, amphibious assault ships start to operate as the central element of an expeditionary strike group, right? Which is an expeditionary assault group or expeditionary strike group. This expeditionary assault group, centered on the amphibious assault ship, also includes submarines, destroyers, and also a cruiser. This cruiser and these destroyers are for protection or a missile umbrella, right? Which provides protection for the main ship. As well as a P-3 Orion, a maritime patrol aircraft, is also added to this expeditionary strike group. And the Iwo Jima class, right? The original 7 ships is complemented by the Tarawa class, which adds 5 more ships to the American fleet, starting in 1971, and also the largest of them until then, which is the Wasp class from 1989, which adds 8 more ships to this inventory, right? Finally, the United States really made a big bet in 2014 with the New America class, which has 11 ships planned. Even though up to the present moment, right, more than 10 years after the approval for the construction of this class, only 2 ships are in operation, the United States ship America and the United States ship Tripoli, our protagonist of today's video, right? The United States ship Tripoli, the second ship of the America class, was commissioned in 2020, and it is known as Landing Helicopter Assault 7 Landing Helicopter. So, what is the air complement, right, of this United States ship Tripoli, the Tripoli? It carries about 20 F-35s, and the F-35s used by the Marines are precisely the F-35s that have vertical takeoff and landing capability. But it also carries a complement of V-22 Ospreys, which are those airplane helicopter hybrids, right? They're extremely unique. They have that ability to transform their flight from vertical to horizontal, with 2 large rotors. And they can carry a pretty large complement of Marines inside their cargo space. And finally, it also carries a complement of helicopters. Seahawk, which is the naval version of the Black Hawk, the one everyone knows from the movie Black Hawk Down, one of the most prolific helicopters of the last 40 years. But where is this ship originally stationed? It's stationed in Okinawa, Japan. It actually supports the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit. You see a lot of that Marine Expeditionary Unit, right? It stands for Marine Expeditionary Unit, or Grupo Expedicionário de Fuzileiros. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit is based at Camp Schwab, there in Okinawa, on the island of Okinawa. At this point now, with the Tripoli being deployed to the Middle East, it becomes part of an amphibious ready group, where it is part of a triad. It's the Tripoli, along with two other ships, the San Diego and a third ship, which are docking ships. So, from then on, the United States. Now, at this present moment, with an expeditionary group of Marines, which is the 31st group, made up of approximately 2,200 Marines, okay? Out of this total of 2,200, about half are actual Marines, the guys who go on the attack. The rest of the contingent is support troops, right? Support personnel, basically all the other services that provide support to the Marine infantry, the Marines who actually go into combat. And from this point on, we're left in suspense because there isn't any clear intention yet from the White House to order these Marines to attack target A or target B. What potential targets could those be? There are two islands, right? Two islands that are being discussed a lot right now, which are Karg Island, as I've mentioned in other videos here, but also Hormuz Island. Hormuz Island gives its name to the Strait of Hormuz. And we've seen that the main focus of the war, right, has shifted from what it was in the first days. There, with President Trump saying he wanted an unconditional surrender from Iran, right? In other words, the complete overthrow of the regime. More recently, the main demand has become the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, before trying to achieve anything related to regime change, the United States now has to focus on reopening the Strait of Hormuz. That's Donald Trump's focus right now, isn't it? And that gives an indication, nobody is saying it's going to be A or B, that probably Karg Island today is considered a secondary objective, and that the primary objective actually would be Hormuz Island or one of the other islands. There, in the Strait of Hormuz, to try to reopen the strait. Once the strait was reopened, that's when you could then attack an island like Karg Island there to be able to harm Iran's economic war, right? But in any case, we still don't have any confirmation. That's why we're still waiting for the deadline, right, of the truce that Donald Trump proposed and established with Iran for another 5 days. So we still don't know for sure what the fate of the Tripoli is or of the Marines it carries. And now tell me, did you already know about the history of amphibious assault ships? Did you already know where they came from and how they work today? Do you think these Marines will actually be used in amphibious operations against Iran? Tell us here in the comments. If you like this video, then share it with your friends. Also, give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to War Room so you don't miss anything else. I'll stop here. Thank you again for watching, and here's a big hug from War Room.